the surgeon of Birkenau, and bring him to Israel to stand trial.
Abrams, you haven't got a chance. Great for Israel.
All right, check Amsterdam, China, and Israel, because that's where the fuck I'm going.
All you Germans, you're too soft on Israel.
And it's okay you pay me minimum wage because I just used the company phone to call my boyfriend in Israel for an hour.
Once we're in West Berlin, they'll be transported to Temple of Air Base, a private charter to Israel.
And the target's Israel.
And they got AL-721 over in Israel.
And when they find out how you did it, then all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel on this day.
As all of Israel mourns, of course everyone says prayers for the people.
I tried not to think about you, but I couldn't.
Assistant managers at Beth Israel.
Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber.
But you do have deep ties to Al-Qaeda I want to ask you about before you get sent to your next location, which might be Israel.
Friend calling him in Israel, you heard that, yes, no?
Chester Ming, the depraved Chinaman, thought jiu-jitsu was in Israel.
Contending for Best Foreign Language Film tonight, movies are from Belgium, Israel, Poland, Canada, and Iran.
Death to Israel and America and all the enemies of Islam!
Eventually, the Arab states will rise against Israel.
Everything you can ask I've done for Israel.
For Israel.
From Israel, Footnote, directed by Joseph Cedar.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Didn't even have to blow up Israel to get there.
I mean, he knows that we live together in Israel, but he doesn't know the...
Hi, Annie, how's the boyfriend in Israel?
How did Israel know? How's Israel winning? I can't come back to Israel.
I could go to Israel, Africa, Afghanistan.
I feel like Israel's pretty good on trees.
If I'm the king of Israel, right?
Israel does not have a king.
I left Israel in 1980 after 3 years in the army.
When I was in Israel a little while ago,
I'm the only journalist in Israel she won't speak to.
But including, incidentally, the laws of the State of Israel, which has no death penalty.
In Israel, before that Europe.
Iraq, China, North Korea, Indonesia, Israel.
Is it because Israel and you Palestine?
Israel better pay off.
Israel will cease to exist.
I told Haim I wasn't moving to Israel.
It's amazing that today in Israel and many Arab countries the fruit's referred to by a totally different name. Mishmish.
I've been to Israel 3 times.
I was born in Israel. I'm not a Yeki.
I would have cashed in my
Israel a good many years ago.
Now it looks like we're gonna have to go to Israel.
Now you think Israel is your mother.
Oh, North Carolina, Israel.
Oh, Jephthah, judge of Israel, what a treasure hadst thou.
Okay, so right off the bat, I'm noticing that Campbell, you're sitting at Israel.
Ralph was under the impression that Ephraim was an observant Jew who only dealt arms as a means to protect Israel from her enemies.
Right, he's buying nukes for Israel, bro. He's a Jew.
Russia, China, England, Israel, India.
Russia, North Korea, India, Israel, China.
So that all on earth know that there is a God in Israel.
So what's next for you, Ben? Israel, right?
Speaking of rain, as you know, every year to celebrate the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, we ask the children to donate money to have a tree planted in Israel.
Filled by Israel. And who mourns for us?
The idea that somebody would put their pregnant wife on a plane...
Would choose because I'm Jewish or because the plane was going to Israel.
Their mission had been to capture him and return him to Israel to stand trial.
Iran has confirmed multiple launches from Russia as well as the UK, Israel.
The presidents of Iran, Russia, Israel, and France have all agreed to your terms.
State of Israel, if you will it, dude, it is no dream. What the fuck you...
Don't think you're dead in Israel.
They found other letters in Israel, of course.
They want nuclear war with Israel.
This isn't about us. This is about Israel.
This is where you're going to be when Israel kick your ass.
2 of 10 portals to the security perimeter into fortified Israel.
We have currently suspended our terrorist supply service as we are engaged in negotiations with Israel.
We'll take him back to Israel. We should have tried to bring him to Israel.
We went to Israel and they love you.
We will capture, then make trade with Israel.
Why is Israel winning?
Mossad, Israel.
You, Israel.
You know, every Jew owes a debt to Israel.
You know, Israel just bombed 2 refugee camps in Syria and Lebanon.
They're working for Israel, a small country.
You should go to Beth Israel.
Zohan, you're not just Israel.